I am Beth Webb. I'm an author and a storyteller, and I'm going to start reading Star Dancer, which is my book about the end of the Iron Age, early Roman period, and this is the second edition, the March Hamilton edition. So it is very slightly different from the old Macmillan edition. Star Child. The stars danced all that night. But the midwife did not stop to watch, for the baby's head was already pushing its way into the world. At last the cord was cut, and the tiny thrashing limbs were wrapped in a woolen shawl. The midwife took the squealing bundle to the door of the cottage and held the infant high to see the lights sparkling in the dark. "There," she said, "that's for you, my dear, to welcome you to the world." Terrified, the exhausted mother tried to sit up. "Get her away from there, Gilda. She hasn't been named yet. The spirits might take her." "Easy, Nessa. She'll be fine. We're inside the house. You know that spirits can't get past an oaken threshold." The midwife shut the door, brought the child back and placed her in the mother's arms. "What are you going to call her?" Nessa sighed. "Clessock wanted a boy. He was going to be Alwa, but now, well..." She smiled down at the tiny round face with its mop of dark hair. Huge eyes stared back at her, amazed. "She's a pretty little thing," Gilda said. "She is indeed." Nessa stroked her baby's cheek. "I'll name her Tegan. Pretty thing." She held the child to her breast and settled back on the straw mattress. Gilda looked down at the mother and baby. She liked moments like these. All was well. She could go to her own bed now without worrying. If the goddess willed, they would both live. She tucked her wild curly hair behind her ears and smiled. "Let her feed, then you should both get some sleep. I've left a basket of dried moss and clean linen for her mess. I'll come back tomorrow. Is there anything else you need before I go?" Nessa glanced around the tidy cottage. The fire in the centre was burning well. A pile of spare wood in the corner. Her bed was warm, and within reach she had an earthenware pot of water, a dish of oatcakes and nuts. "I have everything, thank you. Can Clessock be allowed back now? I'm sure Tegan would like to meet her Da. Oh, and when you go down to the village, would you ask Witten to come and bless the child for me?" "Of course," Gilda smiled. She knew Nessa would not be at ease until the old druid had given his protection to the baby. "But no talking when Clessock comes in. You two must rest." The midwife pushed her feet into her clogs that had been warming by the hearth, then pulling on her cloak she wound it tightly against the winter winds. "Good night then, both of you. May the goddess bless you." She lifted the latch and pulled the wooden door back and gasped, "Just look at that, will you?" Outside, the shower of sparkling lights still moved gracefully across the midnight skies. Nessa turned her head away and concentrated on her baby. She was always nervous about the ways of stars and spirits. Gilda called to Clessock in his forge, where he had been banished during the birthing. "It's a girl child, but they're both well and strong. You will be blessed with a boy soon, of that I'm certain." She turned away briskly. She didn't want to be blamed, as some men believed, for the birth of a girl. Gilda did not need a lamp, for the brilliance of the night lit her way. The path from Clessock and Ness's cottage down to the village where she lived was long, but not steep, winding through leafless oak and hazel woods alongside a chattering stream. At a twist in the path, Gilda stood on an outcrop of rock overlooking the winter seas below. She shivered, for the wind was getting up and had a bitter edge. Icy air roughened the black waters, and the few muddy islets were charcoal smudges in the ebony landscape. But the sight faded as a thick pall of clouds rapidly smothered the stars, and the silvered night was plunged into darkness. "It's almost like the stars don't want to be seen tonight," she muttered to herself. "I'm sure the child is important, but How? Perhaps something secret is going on? Ahead, she could faintly see the Tor, peat black as the goddess's breast, a steep, lonely island rising out of the seas. Tonight there were lights on top of the sacred hill. So, the Druids were watching too. Then the spirits were about. Nessa had been wise to be worried. Gilda guessed there would be no point trying to find Witten until dawn. He wouldn't want to be summoned from his magical doings to bless a girl child, even one born on such a night. Icy splats of rain caught Gilda on the cheek. She tried to wrap her cloak more tightly and yawned. There was still a fair step to go before she found her own fireside and bed. Witten was cold too. He was getting old. His bones creaked and ground painfully as he led his druid brothers along the maze path down the Tor, but his heart was light. The spirits had danced. Just after sunset, while Nessa cried out with birthing pains, the wise ones had gathered to celebrate Imbolc, the festival of spring. Then, just as the night deepened, dancing lights appeared between the legs of the 9-pointed star pattern of the watching woman, the symbol of the mother goddess. The spectacle grew and moved slowly on, leaving 1,000 tiny sparks leaping and scattering across the sky. Below, the miracle was reflected in the dark mirror waters. The Druids watched in awestruck silence. For months, signs and divinations had warned of great evil to come, but there was a promise too. An untimely shower of stars would mark the birth of the one who would stem the tide. But even the wisest of the Druids' sign readers, the Ovates, could not tell what the threat was or who the child would be. But it didn't matter. The goddess had kept her promise, and somewhere close by, the protector of the people of the winter seas was born. All would be well. The Druids watched all night until the glory was swallowed in heavy clouds and the driving rain began. Struggling against the gale, the men processed solemnly down the muddy path to their longhouse on the shore. Inside, by the glow of the central fire, the company shook off their damp outer cloaks and sat around wooden tables. Waiting women brought horns of warm mead and bowls of spiced porridge. The smells mingled with the aroma of juniper shavings thrown into the fire. This was a good night. Witten, the oldest and most honoured of the Druids, rose to his feet. He wore no torques or armbands. His shirt and breeches were made from undyed wool, edged with a narrow blue band. His ash-coloured beard was long and plaited, and his wide whiskers parted as he smiled warmly at his companions. When he raised his silver-bound mead horn, everyone fell silent. Brothers, tonight is Imbolc. Spring is born. Tomorrow you will go back to your own village, knowing that whatever may come, the evil that has been prophesied will never rule in our land. We have a long wait until the child is old enough to stand here with us as our generous chief and our hero. But until then, let us celebrate. The goddess has blessed us. Her child has been born. In the warm red firelight, golden rings and silver armbands glistened as the mead horns were raised. To the child, the Druids cheered. Join me now, Witten went on, in a vow to find the boy and train him. The men roared their approval, slapping the tables with their hands, but seated in the shadows to Witten's left, a white-haired apprentice wearing a silver torque muttered through his teeth. He's gone quite mad. Can't he see a baby is no protection against the coming evil? We need a grown man, a strong leader. Noticing Witten's eyes on him, the young man smiled and raised his horn in mock salute. His master scowled. Hush, Gorgons. Do you think you can stand against what is coming? And why shouldn't it be me? Gorgons hissed. I am a chosen one of Tir na Nog, yet no one gives me the respect I deserve. Respect has to be earned, his master reminded him. Just because you come from the other world, it does not make you a god. Perhaps you need to train for battle instead of learning the ways of wisdom. You know why I don't, Gorgon snapped. He longed to take a sword and be a warrior, but he dreaded the sun god's rage against his colourless skin and weak eyes. He gripped the handle of his dagger and firelight caught the polished blade. I will find a way to take power I deserve, he vowed, even if it means I have to work in the dark. At the head of the table, Witten was still talking loudly, exultant with mead, heat, and exhaustion. The child's name will be Stardancer, he roared, raising his drinking horn. He will be robed as a chieftain in 7 colours of the finest wool, honoured with silver armbands and a golden torque. When the unknown darkness comes, the boy will be ready, and his triumph will make the lands around the winter seas safe for 1,000 years. To Stardancer, long may he live. To Stardancer, the men roared, swigging their mead and holding out their horns for the women to fill them again. The test of fire. Klesek sat for a while, staring into the flames. He rubbed his calloused hands in the warmth. The child was healthy and would be of use to her mother and maybe to him in time, but he had prayed to the goddess for a boy. His work in the forge was a man's work. The rock had to be crushed and ground to extract the silver and the lead. It took a skilled eye to tell the difference and a trained hand to know how to treat them. Then there were the bellows that had to be tended and the charcoal fires that needed watching day and night. He rubbed his sooty fingers through his tousled hair and sighed. Why had the goddess done this to him? Maybe he had forgotten to make the right offerings to the spirits. He would ask Witten when he came to bless and name the child. Klesek poked at a log that had all but turned to ash. It fell, sending a shower of bright sparks up into the dark of the roof. The girl had been born at a strange time, with the stars dancing like that. Perhaps she would be a bit special. If she grew to be a beauty, she might fetch a high bride price and bring a young man with strong arms to the forge. Klesek scratched his beard and looked at his woman. Nessa stirred on her makeshift bed. Her long dark hair was loose and spread over her shoulders like a pool of peat water. But the birth had left her face thin and sharp. Cradled in her freckled arms, the baby was sleepily suckling milk and drooling over her shawl. Klesek smiled. As Gilda had said, at least Nessa was strong and fertile. Why shouldn't there be more children? He straightened his back and yawned. He needed sleep. He would ask Witten what sacrifices were required to ensure a boy next time. Gilda did not have to summon the druid. He came to her. The sun was high and she had slept late. Witten called and knocked until she woke. Sleepily, she pulled a heavy woolen dress over her shift and stumbled to the door, praying it wasn't another child to deliver. She was so tired she couldn't remember if any other woman were due. She tried to think. She knew Derwin, the village wise woman, was near her time, but not for another half moon, surely. Gilda tugged back the heavy door and was relieved to see the old man stooped and weary on the threshold. She took his hand. Come in, father. Can I offer you some honey cakes? No, I'm in a hurry, Witten said, perching on a stool. Gilda knelt by the hearthstone and poked the fire to life. Warm red sparks lit her plump face as she turned to smile at him. I was going to come and find you this morning, she said. I have a message. Then I'm glad. Tell me, was a baby born last night? Gilda leaned back on her haunches and pushed her hair from her eyes. Well, yes, that's why I was coming to see you. The mother asked whether you would give the blessing. Witten sighed with relief and smiled at the small patch of sky that gleamed through a gap in the thatch. Blessed be, he said, he has been born. It is true. Gilda frowned. No, father, he is a she. Witten, still euphoric, didn't hear. To think that I am alive to give the child his name and blessing. What an honour. There will be songs sung about this day. Father Whitten, Gilda took the old man's hand once more. Eh? It wasn't a boy child, it was a girl. She's to be called Tegan, born last night to Nessa, a woman of Clessock, who works lead and silver in the hills. A healthy child. The old man glowered, his moustache twitching with irritation. Can't be a girl. Did you look properly? Gilda laughed and wiped her hands. Father, I know the difference between a boy and a girl, and Nessa's baby is most definitely a girl. When was she born? Whitten leaned forward intently, his deep eyes willing Gilda to change her story. At dawn, did you say, or after it started raining? No, the stars were out, bright as day. I took her to the door to see how they danced to welcome her into the world. It was so pretty. Whitten hauled himself to his feet, wincing as his knees creaked. You had no right, he snapped. Now, enough about the girl. Where is the boy child born last night? Gilda was livid. What right had this old man to tell her what she could and couldn't do, especially when it came to birthing? Hands on hips, she glared right back at him. I was up all night with Nessa. She gave birth to a girl. The stars were out and they danced a pretty show to welcome the babe. There was no boy, not from Nessa's belly anyway. There was no twin waiting and there were no other calls for my help. You'll just have to go and look for yourself if you want another child from last night. But you mark my words. She stepped forward and shook her finger at him. I may not be a white robe, but I know for certain that little Tegan is going to be special. Whitten backed away towards the door and stumbled into the chilly morning light. The druid went straight back to Clessock's cottage. The silversmith invited him inside. There Nessa was seated in a wooden chair, her long dark hair tied back and the shoulder pin of her dress undone so she could feed the child. As the visitor came in, she pulled a shawl around herself and the baby. Wheezing and exhausted, Whitten sat and sipped warm ale for a while. Let me see the child, he said at last. Nessa still found walking difficult, so Clessock carried the baby to him. Before taking the child, Whitten asked, Do you accept her? Nessa bit her lip. This was the moment when Clessock could refuse his daughter and she would be taken out on the hillside to die. It was a common fate for unwanted girls and children born with twisted limbs. She glanced at her man, but she needn't have worried. Clessock smiled down at the precious bundle in his arms, and with his work-stained fingers he touched the little one's downy hair. I accept her gladly. She will be lucky for us, I feel it in my bones. Nessa's face glowed. Her man would never regret this moment. Tegan would be brought up to respect him and always do as he said. Whitten nodded. He stood, let his cloak fall and reached out for the child. I will need to examine her. If you do not wish to stay, then it does not matter. You might not like what I do, but I promise she will come to no harm. Clessock glanced at Nessa. We'll stay. Then you must remain silent and not stop me whatever happens. Of course, said Clessock. Nessa felt her heart sink. More rituals, more inviting the spirits into human affairs. But she couldn't leave her baby, not for a moment. She stared at her hands. I agree. Whitten carefully unwrapped the child and peeled the sodden mosses away from her bottom. Then he opened the door to let in light, and he examined her carefully. She is perfect, he announced at last. Nessa longed to say, Of course she is, but remembered her promise just in time and bit her lip hard. The baby looked at Whitten quizzically and peed over his hands and down the front of his robe. He tried not to scowl as he shook off the drips. Then, holding the naked infant under her arms, he walked back to the hearth and lifted Tegan high above the flames of fire. He intoned a tuneless, wordless sound through his nose, and as he did so, sparks rose, scorching the baby's back. She howled and thrashed. Whitten brushed the cinders away and peered at her skin, frowned, then handed her back to her terrified mother. The screaming baby struggled as Nessa wrapped her up and gave her a finger to suck. She glared at the druid, her blue eyes bright with anger and dread. Clesic clenched and unclenched his hands, trying to control his fury. Neither of them dared to speak. Then, hitching up the hem of his robe, Witten bent his cracking knees and lowered himself to squat on the earth floor. "Do you have her call?" Clesic fetched it from the rafter where it had been hung to dry. It was only one day old and still damp and soft. Chanting a nasal incantation, Witten laid the birth sack on the edge of the hearthstones. Then he rattled a leather pouch and spilled a collection of bone shards onto the bloody remains. Most of them bounced off into the ashes. The old druid stared hard for a few seconds, and with a shaking finger he touched those that had stayed in place. Red lines like broken twigs were painted on each piece. He muttered as if he was talking to someone invisible. Nessa averted her gaze in case she saw something she shouldn't. The less the spirits knew about her child, the better. There was enough bad luck in life without inviting more. She clutched her baby inside the woolen wrappings, wishing she could make her disappear beneath the folds. At last the old man looked up and stroked the plaits of his beard as he thought. His head was skull-like in the firelight. Deep black shadows hid his face, yet as he lifted his gaze, his eyes gleamed. He coughed and spat. Nessa hugged her child closer still. Why had Witten tested her baby with fire? "Oh, Mother Goddess, make him go away, please," she prayed silently. The old druid sucked his gums as he stooped to gather up the bones. "Her fortune is clouded from me," he muttered at last. He stood, pulled on his cloak and picked up his staff. Clesic opened the door for him. Feeling as if she could breathe again, Nessa pulled aside the shoulder of her dress once more and tucked the baby against her breast. Witten hesitated on the threshold, then turned back and scowled, the white of his cloak and hair harsh against the afternoon light. For a moment he seemed to be a standing stone, cold, impassive. "It's a shame that she's a girl," he said. "If she'd been a boy, things would have been much clearer." "I wanted to ask you about that," Clesic said. We, he added, glancing at Nessa, "we'd like, well, what do we do to have to make sure that the next child is a boy?" "I will talk to you about that," Witten replied. Then he held out his hands. "Let me have her once more." Cradling the baby gently in his arms, the druid lifted her towards the east and chanted a welcome and a blessing. He did not see the fear and pain in the mother's eyes. Thank goodness she is a girl, Nessa thought bitterly. Witten finished his incantation, returned the baby and leaned on his stick. "Gilda said you've chosen a name." "She's Tegan, pretty thing," Nessa replied without looking up. "Then Tegan she'll be called. Send her to me at her first bleeding. She will need a strong word of power to protect her. I will decide her true name then. Meanwhile," he sighed sadly, "give thanks to the goddess that you are both alive." And he turned to go. Clesic followed him out of the door. "Father, what were you going to say about getting a boy?" As the two men walked away, Gilda arrived, panting from the exertions of the hill climb. Her cheery face was redder than usual, and her unruly hair almost free of its leather thong, and under her cloak she carried a small basket of dried herbs. "Hello, my dear." A warm smile revealed her few remaining teeth. She closed the door behind her and pulled shutters across the windows, making the cottage comfortingly dark with just the hearth fire for light. Nessa said nothing as the midwife gossiped and bustled about, making a tisane with boiling water from the small iron cauldron that simmered amongst the hot ashes. "Give me Tegan," Gilda said, "then drink this. You look exhausted. It will help you sleep." Nessa sipped and sighed quietly to herself. Gilda's motherly presence made her want to spill out all her terror. But Nessa never allowed her real emotions to show. She tried to hide her loves, joys and fears under a blanket of heart snow, scared that if she showed what she really felt, those she cared for would be in danger from the jealousy of the spirit world. Gilda eased her bulky frame onto a low stool and unwrapped Tegan's shawl. As she turned the baby over to wipe her bottom, she saw the scorch marks of a star pattern. The midwife said nothing, but touched each tiny burn in turn, her lips moving silently with long-forgotten words. She took a deep breath and smiled at Nessa. "I've been that busy since I saw you last," she said. "Derwin gave birth to her child this morning. It was born too early. She didn't send for me and it died. Though what she's doing giving birth at her age, I'll never know. It's far too dangerous. She's lucky to be alive, if you ask me." Tegan, her rage completely gone, sprawled naked and contented across the midwife's plump thighs. Gilda chatted on and on as she rubbed the child with chamomile and oil. "It's odd, but it's almost as if Derwin knew her baby wouldn't live. She had a funeral basket woven already. The babe was all in it, and the top was closed by the time I got there. She asked me to dig the grave." Gilda paused. "I wish I'd been there to help, but you know Derwin. She's so full of her being the village wise woman and all, she has to do everything her way." Despite her weariness and anger, Nessa couldn't stop herself smiling. It was all so true. Although she was sad and her baby had died, becoming a mother might have softened Derwin a little. Gilda stopped what she was doing and looked at Nessa. "Between you and me, I think Derwin would have liked to have been a druid given half a chance." "Some women are druids," Nessa said sleepily. Gilda was quiet for a moment and stared into the flame. Her voice was sad when she spoke again. "There hasn't been one round these parts for years. If you ask me, Derwin is bitter. Goodness knows what about. She has everything a woman could want." She sighed deeply. "She's feared and respected by everyone, and she's had Witten twisted round her little finger for years." Hastily wrapping Tegan in fresh bindings and a clean shawl, Gilda knelt and laid the baby by her mother's side. Then, heaving to her feet, she turned away, her head bowed and dabbing at her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. When she turned back, she was brisk and cheerful once more. "Now, over on your side, Nessa. Let's have a look at you. By the way, how did Tegan get those marks on her back? Did you lay her too near the fire?" Nessa didn't have the energy to complain. The Tisane was working and sleep was engulfing her in heavy waves. She lay quietly as she was washed. Gilda tucked her in with blankets. "You'll do nicely. I expect there will be another little one soon." Nessa groaned. The very thought of giving birth again filled her with dread. At last Gilda left, grateful for the peace. Nessa curled her arms around her baby and fell asleep. 2 nights later, Klesik arrived home with a squirming bundle wrapped in his cloak. He was apprehensive as he pushed open the cottage door. What would Nessa say? He was certain he'd done the right thing, but would she agree? Klesik kissed his wife and daughter. "What have you there?" asked Nessa. With his free hand, he stroked Nessa's dark plaits. "Put Tegan down and I'll show you." He held out the bundle. Nessa laid Tegan on her crib and took the squirming shape and pulled back the wrappings. "It's a baby boy," she exclaimed. "Whose is he?" "I don't know," Klesik shrugged. "I found him when I was checking the charcoal fires up by the waterfall." "Abandoned?" Nessa was amazed. Boys were usually kept unless they were deformed. This child seemed strong and well. "I think he might be a half-head," Klesik replied. "Look at his eyes and hands." "Well, it's difficult to tell in this light," Nessa said, taking the baby closer to the fire as she unfolded his fingers. "He's so cold. He must have been almost dead when you found him. Why did you bring him home? He's been left for a reason. Maybe the father refused him." Nessa was confused. Part of her wanted to put the child to the breast, but she was frightened. What if they offended some spirit by snatching the child from his due fate? The child's curse might be brought down on them all. Klesik led Nessa back to her chair. "Listen, I will tell you the truth, then we can decide what should be done. When Witten came to bless our Tegan, I asked him what offerings I could make to ensure a boy. He told me to throw a piece of my best silver into the mouth of the river spirit where she flows from the cave at the head of our valley. I wasn't checking the fires. I'd taken the best double-twisted talk and gone up to the waterfall and made my offering. You know how much we'll need a young man to help us hereabouts, especially as you and I get older. No one wants to leave the comfort and safety of the summer fields to work burning charcoal all year. Then, as I walked home, I heard a baby crying. I followed the sound, but it stopped. The cry came again, and I found a bundle at the edge of the path. I picked it up, and here it is, a boy child ready born with no danger to you. It's a bitter night out. I couldn't leave him. But what use is a half-head? Nessa scowled. He'll never be able to do much. Clessock crouched by Nessa's side and put his arm around her shoulders. They work hard, and if the task is kept simple, they don't complain or run away. I'll teach him to burn charcoal. Even if he's only good enough to watch it and let me know if a break appears, it'll be something. At least I can get on with the smelting and casting in between times. It just seems so strange to be asking for a boy child 1 minute, and there he was right by my feet. Somehow it seemed wrong to just walk past and let him die. He may have been cast out, but he was left by the path, so maybe the spirits wanted him to be found. Clessock looked hopefully at Nessa. What do you think? The child was already suckling at her breast. Are we going to call him Alwa? She asked, all thoughts of spirits and curses gone clean from her head. No, let's save that for our own son. What do you think? Shall we call him Griff? Clessock closed his eyes and bowed his thanks to the air spirits of the east, the bringers of hope.